Hello, has anybody joined us there? Hello, everyone. We'll give people a couple of minutes and then we'll get started. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar, or if you are watching it as a recording. My name's Birgit Schonafinger. I've had the role of the Community Engagement Lead for this project, and we're excited to have the team here today to present the findings from the feasibility study for the Wodonga microgrid as part of the Active Energy Precincts project. Those who've been involved so far know it's been a relatively long journey, so we're pretty excited to be at this stage now to share what the findings were, and we encourage you to join in through the process today and ask any questions that you might have in the chat box. So today we have Priya Galketiya from Monash University joining us to present the feasibility study results. And Robyn Nicholas is Wodonga Council's Sustainability Coordinator. And I'd like to hand over to her now to provide the acknowledgement of country. And then we look forward to hearing from you through the webinar.
Thanks very much, Birgit, and welcome everybody. Wodonga Council acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples of the country. We also acknowledge them as traditional owners and custodians across the various lands. We pay our respect to their ancestors, elders, children and young people. We acknowledge the strength and resilience of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and recognise their continuous connections to lands, waters and communities across the country. We also extend that respect to all First Nations people who are participating in this webinar. Thank you. I'll hand over to Priya.
Thanks, Robyn, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today and giving up some of your time. So today we've got the webinar for the Active Energy Precincts project around the outcomes of the feasibility study. And as Birgit mentioned, it's been a long journey and we're close to wrapping it up. So today, for those who are getting in touch with the project for the first time, we're just giving a bit of an overview and then going through some of the community engagement processes that and metrics that we had throughout the project, and then getting into, I guess, the crux of today, which is some of the modelling, the approaches and the outcomes in relation to Wodonga in particular. And then we'll be looking at the roles and functions that communities will need to consider in progressing the outcomes to the next phase of implementing a system through the next steps section in today's webinar. And then, of course, please feel free to send through any questions you might have as we go through, as Birgit mentioned, through the Q&A function, and we can answer them as we go, as well as having a bit of a session at the end. So in terms of the Active Energy Precincts project, I guess the project came about originally based on Monash's own net zero journey and how we could enable others in the community to make their own energy transition. And one of the objectives of the project was to enable people to compare their like individual options or individual needs, such as, you know, obviously cost, reliability or resilience, and that issue of driving emissions down in general. How could they compare what they need to do or are considering doing on their own homes versus something that is providing benefits across a larger group, such as the community, and looking at how microgrids, and in this project we've referred to the systems as local energy systems, how can they deliver the benefits across those three areas of resilience, cost, and around net zero and driving emissions down at a community level that would provide individuals options to consider, as opposed to, I guess, putting their own money into their own home, and potentially getting greater benefits out of the system. So the solutions that we're looking at, these local energy systems that I just referred to, are looking at taking, I guess, those traditional functions of an electricity network, of, generation occurring at, I guess, a location that is quite distant to most people's properties, and then the transmission and distribution of that energy through the poles and wires down to their home, and bringing them to a local level. So transferring some of those functions using the technology available today through renewables and battery storage system, to move that generation capability into a local setting in the community. Moving some of the functions that the operators carry out in the distribution and transmission networks to a microgrid operator. So an important note to call out here is that the project is not looking at islanding whole communities or whole townships through this study. It's really looking at what are referred to as grid interacting systems. So there's still an interface that is required with those transmission and distribution operators, and that's the role that microgrid operator would play. And of course, providing that electricity to the end user that are more and more becoming what is referred to as a prosumer, with the ability to have their own generation and storage capacity on their own homes or businesses, and becoming more involved in the overall system. So that solution that we're looking at, we've sort of used a hub and spoke approach to apply that local energy system function into a community, to try and achieve those three goals or drivers that we referred to earlier. And in that hub and spoke approach, the hubs that we refer to are really sites within the community that have been identified to have value within the community, whether it be commercial or from a community resilience perspective. And I guess ideally be geographically co-located, and that simply means that they need to be neighboring sites, and have, I guess this is an important one, have the ability to, or rather the capacity to have additional generation and storage infrastructure deployed, and that's more solar systems and more battery storage capability on their sites, even if they already have them. So that's a key one. And whilst I mentioned that we're not looking at islanding whole townships or communities, we are looking for that capability for these hub locations to be able to island during what we refer to as a resilience event, where a community might have an outage as a result of a bushfire or a storm event, or significant reliability issues, and allow that location to keep supply available, and a location that could act as a potential relief center or recovery location for the community to gather at and operate while the rest of the network is out of action. So that is an important capability that we'd ideally like the hub sites to have. The spokes are essentially the other users within the system. So the individual sites, the commercial or residential sites that would participate, and they're located within the energy precinct that's been identified. And that boundary is really a soft boundary, because the main, it's not dependent on the network configuration for who can participate in these systems. It's their virtual participation. And then, of course, those individual sites can also be a source of renewable energy and storage and other services for the system. So the hubs that have been identified in Wodonga through working obviously closely with council and some of our local stakeholders, we've identified 2 hubs with that met some of those initial needs that I referred to previously. And the 2 hubs that have been identified differ in terms of their energy profile. One being a more community-oriented centre with the civic hub centred around council offices, and then the industrial hub, which is centred around the Arnold's fruit and vegetable properties. So I guess whilst they are differing in their energy use, an important point to raise here is that there is quite a varied energy profile between the properties at both of these hubs. And that's important because it allows us to identify, I guess, that generation and storage capacity that can be deployed and provide scale. And that really is something that has been, I guess, a finding through our work at Monash, and that ability to provide the economic viability to the system, and hence why part of the reason these 2 sites were chosen to, I guess, progress through the feasibility study phase. So with that, we'll get into some of the details around the modelling, but first we thought it'd be great to hear from Birgit around some of the community engagement pieces that's happened through the project. Thanks, Birgit.
Thanks. Yeah, so community engagement was a key focus for this project, probably a point of difference to other projects that might have been undertaken in the past that were similar. And before I started with the project, a previous person had undertaken about 13 one-on-one meetings with key stakeholders, and what the project team learnt from that was what people's interests were and what questions they had about something like this, in order that the rest of the project could be shaped. We also undertook a survey. In Wodonga, we had 59 responses from residents and small businesses, and that asked some more questions about whether they already had solar and what their main reasons for being interested were, and we'll come to some more information on that soon. We also had focus groups online, and the team came to Wodonga in November for a community workshop where we again heard from the community about why they would get involved in something like this, and also what their questions were, and those questions were really valuable in shaping the information that's been put together in the feasibility report, because the team wanted to answer those questions, and again, some of them are in the next slide. We also had an e-newsletter for the project, and the subscribers, where we had about 85 sign up for that, and a really high response rate. So the open rate for those newsletters ranged from 60 as the lowest open rate to 70%, which showed that the people that had signed up were really interested to see how it was progressing. And as I said, from the survey and the community information session, the sentiments that the community told us they had about this project were that contributing to having a more resilient community, and also sharing their solar power with others, were the highest drivers for having an interest in it. And people said that they were willing to pay the same, or maybe even a little bit more, for some additional benefits from the project, and that it wasn't really driven by cost. And as Priya said, I think earlier, that this project is actually running across 3 shires in Victoria, and there was a similar interest level and similar reasons in the other 2 municipalities as well. One of the keys to having this microgrid project implemented in any of these communities is understanding how it will be governed and also how it could be funded. And the community told us in Wodonga that a hybrid model of governance was something that they were open to, but highly also what we heard was that people need a lot more information. This is a pretty new concept, and they were interested in understanding it more. The funding sources, similarly, there was a high interest in some community investment, and that was really interesting from the point of view of a project like this being grounded in community engagement and the community showing that they do have a high level of interest. So now we have Robyn from Wodonga Council to tell us a bit about what Council in Wodonga is up to in regards to solar projects.
Thanks, Birgit. So Wodonga Council has been fortunate enough to be able to support a lot of solar projects on our facilities, and I've laid them out in the slide there to explain where those they are located. So at this stage, we've got a total install of just over 476 kilowatts, and that has seen us at least 550 tonnes of carbon avoided through just the solar alone as the projects. And that's the equivalent to 12,700 trees that have been planted. On the right-hand side there, the return on investment, you can see the blue and the green, and that explains where we're at on those projects in the payback periods. The other thing that we're looking at is trying to reduce council emissions. We joined the Victoria Electricity Collaboration project in July 2020, and that saw us 75% reduction in our energy costs as far as emissions was concerned. Prior to that, the VECO average was about 9,800 to 6,000 per year. And our top emitting assets are street lighting and the Wodonga Sports and Leisure Centre, which now has a very large solar on it. So the street lighting, we have now undertaken two projects. They're in two stages. One was in 2017 and the other was just in 2022. And we've changed all of our street lighting over to LED street lighting, and that has seen a considerable drop in emissions. So Council's working very hard to try and reduce emissions, and we're getting there slowly. Thank you.
Thanks, Robyn. So, of course, the project was primarily carrying out a feasibility study in the three regions that Birgit mentioned. And I guess the approach that was taken to modelling the systems, I thought it would be worth just clarifying that approach. So as you can see on your screen, there's three sort of scenarios that have been considered. And the scenario that we refer to as the base case is really just to provide a comparison or a baseline for the analysis. And what that involved was the analysis of, I guess, behind the meter installations at a single site within that hub location, and understanding what those installations could, how they could be optimized and what they could achieve based on those individual operations, to provide the baseline. Then that would allow us a good comparison point to the two other scenarios you can see on your screen. The first one, which is a single hub multiple participant scenario, is really the main focus of the feasibility study. And it's really bringing those hub sites together and understanding then what the economies of scale that could be achieved and realized through a hub containing all of those operations, and then what is possible to be achieved from a resilience perspective from that location, and then bringing in the number of users, so that the residential participants and small businesses that would participate, and understand the potential scale and see if there's a impact from a numbers perspective, as well as understanding, I guess, a minimum viable point to start the system at. The last scenario is, I guess, the multiple participant scenario, where we're looking at those hubs that have been identified operating in unison. So I guess it's important to identify here that there's no interaction between the hubs from a resilience perspective. However, you will be able to service more of the community during those resilience events, and obviously have greater scale of economies with the infrastructure that's deployed and significant project savings. So, and there's another aspect to this, is the potential for, I guess, the roadmap for deployment once an initial system is deployed, understanding how another system could interact with that system in the future. So that was also modeled to provide some understanding in that context. There was also some sensitivities built into the modeling to understand how they would impact their outcomes, specifically also from a financial perspective, but also from a technical capability perspective. So I mentioned the number of participants. Obviously that can have an impact to the scale of the system and the minimum sizing of equipment. So that was factored in. There was also trying to understand how much resilience could each system deliver as a baseline, but also if there was a need for the community to invest in infrastructure to provide additional resilience. That was also reviewed. And also looking at demand increases over time. So with more and more electrification processes occurring, people moving off natural gas, and EVs becoming a feature in future years, understanding how that demand at people's homes and on the network would impact the system. And lastly, but also not leastly, also system efficiency. So understanding how the impact of, for example, your solar systems generating at different capacities, especially from that resilience perspective, how that would impact what people would be able to utilize from the system, was also reviewed. So in Wodonga, that modelling, which is still sort of being tweaked at the moment, but it showed some very positive results. And so I guess the key one, and in relation to some of those sentiments that Birgit took us through from the workshops, is that the tariffs that people would be expected to pay are more or less what the current tariffs are on, or potentially cheaper than what they're currently on. So that was really heartening. The other positive outcome was that the expected resilience that was available at the hubs was quite significant, without the need for, I guess, investment specifically in infrastructure for resilience alone, such as, for example, generators. So we're looking at sort of 3 days of normal operations at those sites over either summer or winter at 80% of load. So that's quite a significant resilience capability from the systems. So as you can see, the systems that have been sized at these sites are quite significant. They're not a residential scale by any means. So, you know, we're talking about at the Civic Hub, we've got about 1 megawatt of additional solar capacity, as well as 1700 kilowatt hours capability of a battery energy storage system. So that's quite significant. Also, critically, we looked at the financial aspect of these projects and looked at how different funding avenues could supplement the potential for these projects to proceed. So we looked at the payback periods, and they were quite heartening. So for the Civic Hub, they're looking at around 3 years with 50% grant funding, and you can essentially double that if it wasn't supplemented by grant funding. So it was quite a positive outcome in terms of the modelling. So in terms of roles and functions that these systems would require, it was keen to, or good to sort of discuss with the community members and understand what I guess they needed. And it was really clear that there was, from a participation point of view, there was really simplicity required, and I think that was really key. And in terms of that participation mode, it was like looking at a very similar sort of approach to your current retail contract. And so in terms of the participants, and that includes the hubs, it would be a very normal contractual sort of approach. And then you've got other functions that you need within the system that are really specialized services that you would look to providers to be involved through a partner or contractual arrangement to deliver those services. They're really not services that you would expect to be delivered from within the community because they're highly specialized, and in some cases require certain licensing and occupational health and safety requirements to be addressed. And the last sort of function that we talk about in these systems is around ownership and governance. And Birgit mentioned the sort of strong community sentiment to have some level of community involvement, and I think that's really key for this, and we'll talk about that in the next steps to progress these systems forward. But that is an area that community and other community organizations can get involved in. So as I mentioned, you know, how do sort of communities progress what the outcomes of this project in the feasibility study to implementing a system. And so then it's really about considering what they need to do to become investment ready. Because the feasibility study, I guess, addresses these that initial planning component of a microgrid system project lifecycle. And so communities need to sort of, I guess, consider some of the next steps to allow them to move through the implementation. And we've sort of tried to identify some of these components, and the feasibility report that will be coming out in the next week, which will be publicly available and have the details for each of the regions that we've carried out feasibility studies for. We'll go into a bit more detail around these next steps. But in terms of a high level of that, it's really looking at an informal community organization coming together to be able to act on behalf of the community to try and understand the pathway for a formal community group. And when I say formal in this context, it's really about becoming a legal entity that can represent the community and obviously accept funding and raise revenue, and also enter into contractual agreements. So that is something that needs to be done initially. And once that sort of pathway has been decided and not necessarily, I guess, formalized, then that group can start identifying, I guess, their options in terms of delivery partners and assessing the options of this feasibility study to find which option they'd like to progress first. And also, of course, identifying the size of the system they'd like to try and achieve by identifying those initial participants. So in this matrix that you can see on your screen, we've tried to sort of identify who would be the groups or the people that might be best positioned to be involved in the different aspects of ownership, governance, and operations. And I guess the key thing that we were trying to communicate here was that for communities to ensure that they realize the maximum benefit of these systems and also maintain some level of governance of these systems, there really needs to be a pretty robust framework that ensures that there is, I guess, the separation of ownership and governance from that service delivery or operating functionality. So, and there's also, I guess, the ability then to ensure that the benefits of the system, such as revenue or driving down energy costs, can flow through to the participants, which are your obviously members of your community. So in this project, we've sort of targeted the requirements of the government grants such as ARENA, and that is really the next part of the process that this community group would need to do, is identify and source funding to progress through the implementation. And so grants such as ARENA, which is the federal government's renewable agency, have funding buckets for systems such as microgrids that allow funding for example, in this case, up to 50% for funding. And so if a community decides to go down that path, they obviously need to source funding, the other 50%, from elsewhere, whether it's be fundraising within the community or through private investment. So those are some of the decisions that communities would need to consider as they go through that process. As I mentioned, there'll be a lot more detail around those steps within the report, and I guess options that are open for communities to consider. So you should look out for that, hopefully coming out in the next week, and we'll be making sure that we send a link through to all the participants and registrants of this webinar in the coming week with that information. So with that, probably we've got some time for some question and answer session. It'd be great to hear any questions that any of you have on what we've presented, and obviously in relation to systems at Wodonga. Yeah, we can throw it open. So if you want to use the chat function in Zoom, that'd be great.
Thanks for that, Priya. Yeah, it's obviously pretty exciting for the team to get to this point and to be able to highlight that there's a payback for such a project in Wodonga in 3 years. And I can imagine that some of the community members will be very interested in the detail in the report. But one of the questions that we have had asked during this process, which I think is relevant to revisit while the attendees are sorting out their questions, is could you explain the boundaries of the precincts, Priya? And that is from a physical, do you have to physically be in that precinct in order to participate, or could you connect to it virtually?
Yeah, thanks, Birgit. Yeah, we have had that question quite a bit throughout the project. And the key thing to understand is that for a hub site, a hub participant obviously needs to be located in that precinct location and connected to the part of the network that we're looking at. But for all other participants, and this is really for residential participants and small businesses that are not located in that hub, they don't need to be connected physically to the same part of the network as the hub. They can be located anywhere within the region. It's really a soft boundary, and we refer to it as a virtual participation. So they would be involved through that contract mechanism and be able to participate.
Okay, we don't have any questions from the attendees at the moment. So I just wondered if we could have a look at how the community stays involved now that this project is at the feasibility reporting end, and therefore the conclusion of this project. How does the community stay involved if they want to progress it from here?
Yeah, so we'll be having the feasibility studies published on the website, energyprecincts.com.au. So everyone will be able to go and see that. That'll be live by next week. And in that, that'll obviously have the report and all the information related to the project. There'll also be links to some other resources, as well as, I guess, how people can stay involved in their region. And for Wodonga, I'll throw it over to Robyn to make some comments around how people can sort of stay involved in this project.
Thanks, Priya. Yeah, so if anybody wants to get involved with regards to the project, or for that matter, anything to do with sustainability, if they can email us, info@wodonga.vic.gov.au, or look on our website, and there's quite a lot of information under our corporate documents with regards to the sustainability strategy and the climate change adaptation action plan, if they'd like to have a look at more of what we're up to and maybe make some suggestions. Thank you.
Okay, well, there are still no questions coming in. So if you have questions after today, obviously please send them through to our email address or Robyn at council. I've just popped that info at Wodonga in the chat, and we thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us today, and yeah, we'll look forward to publishing the information. And if you, as Birgit mentioned, if you have any more questions, please feel free to send them through to the email addresses that are on the website.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.